brought two books. I like doing that. They're pretty boring books, but anyhow, that's how I write. For library, I don't know. You will decide. Well, today I want to talk about this little book that I have just completed, and that is really part of a project that has a second book also coming now. And it is sort of the organizing premise or organizing idea, proposition, is that the language of inequality is not enough to capture the deep consequential transformations that are happening, especially in the West, but we begin to see it also in the East. And those are very problematic categories, the West and the East, but I'm just using that for shorthand. So Europe, Latin America, North America. Latin America has a very mixed, some very good things happening, and parts of Africa really are a core sort of set of empirical cases for me. Inequality is happening. And I've been writing about inequality for 20 years. In my Global City book, I was already seeing, when nobody was talking about inequality, really, I was saying we're moving towards growing inequality because the middle sectors are becoming less necessary, they are being replaced by machines, etc., etc. But nobody at that time, say if you were in the United States or in Europe, could see the fact of inequality, because what they were seeing was gentrification in our major cities, and it looked like everything was getting better. Of course, beneath the gentrification were a lot of displacements, a lot of homelessness, but the visual order, the physical visual order, was one that suggested growing prosperity, but it was actually growing prosperity for a few. And in the case of a city like New York, they literally shipped out the homeless people. First, they put them in hotels, in homeless hotels in New York City, but then eventually they shipped them out to render them invisible, if you want, to sort of poorer suburbs, etc., etc. So, but I was seeing this question of inequality. So I believe that inequality, growing inequality, is a reality. My argument is slightly different. I don't deny the whole question of inequality nor its importance. But inequality is ultimately a distribution. We can have more, less. So long as we have highly differentiated societies, we're going to have inequality. So when people just simply invoke inequality is the problem, I don't think that is satisfactory, because we've always had it. But sometimes, there was a bit more social justice, if you want, with the inequality than we have today. So today it's a very acute condition. So I look in my Expulsions book at a very particular set of issues. One way of describing it is to say that familiar conditions take on extreme forms at some point. Think of everything as a variable. Take on extreme forms. And in that moment, they become invisible to our statistical categories, to our conceptual categories, because it's so extreme that we lose it. So I'm really interested in that sort of set of systemic edges, where the familiar condition becomes extreme, and in that moment that it becomes extreme, we don't see it. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean, but just to sort of illustrate with a familiar case, the very long-term unemployed, they are lost. They are lost to statistical counts of unemployment. The people who are displaced, the people who lose, the 15 million households in the United States who are basically thrown out of their homes in a period of 10 years. That's a lot of material stuff, invisible, because they're not counted, they disappear. When small businesses in Italy and in Greece, when the owner commits suicide because the business simply cannot be rescued, the economic crisis, etc. If that businessman or that owner, or that businesswoman, but it's mostly men in this case, if they didn't submit a bankruptcy statement before they committed suicide, it's not counted. It's invisible. Now, not many people who are so desperate that they're going to commit suicide are going to have the clarity of mind, oh my God, I must for the statistics, so that, no, they don't. So, and another issue that for me is a big, big deal, dead land and dead water. According to the scientists, we have over 440 pieces of coastal waters, zones, areas that are dead. We have a lot of land that is dead. The Midwest, the breadbasket of the world, as the Americans call it very, very modestly, it still looks green at the surface, all those fertilizers. But the temperature of that land in the last few years has been getting hotter and hotter. So it is dying. Not all of it, but good parts of it. And all of that is very material, but it's not immediately visible. And I like to argue, with dead land and dead water, but especially dead land, that we should have that on our maps. Our maps should show dead land. We did that. And I say in kindergarten, the kiddies, they should understand, look at all that dead land that we have. Yeah, and mommy and daddy actually helped making that. That is sort of what I'm trying to get at. There are major processes that are really, one image is, in the social sciences, we would say they're going on the other side of the curve. It's not simply more of the same. It is an altered condition. So in this little book, which really aims at it's a bit of a wake-up call, it's a bit of a provocation, it's a bit of documenting stuff that is lost in a lot of the the narrow social science discussion about inequality, for instance. So that is a bit the aim. Now, for this kind of research, when I'm in my experimental mode, and Kamal, I should have said, when he mentioned my first book, Kamal, I don't know if I ever told you the story, was rejected by 12 publishers. Can you imagine if that happens to you? You would not feel very good. And I believed in that book. I was so absolutely a foreigner out of it. So I said, this is a good book that I wrote. I sent it. This is by the way, if you're confused, I'm just making a footnote, okay? I've left the dead land and dead water for a bit. I'm just talking about. So I thought, good book. I sent it out. At that time you sent out one publisher, answer comes back, no. I didn't change a thing. I said, I'm going to violate the rules of the game a bit. And I sent it simultaneously to 2 publishers. That you're not supposed to do that. No. Then I said, to hell with this. I sent it out to 7 publishers. No. I don't know what kind of person I was at that point, because, it just provoked me every time. Instead of me feeling defeated, I said, and so, the 13th publisher, Cambridge University Press, I really was lucky that it was a good press, published it. But that was a kind of, that also is the cost that you can pay, the price you can pay when you are doing something that is a bit off the paradigm. Now back to my story. So to do this kind of research, I have come to understand, expose, that my site, my place, the location for research, is what one might describe the fuzzy edges of paradigmatic knowledge. I don't reject paradigmatic knowledge. Sometimes my students come and they say, I'm just going to throw that paradigm out of the window. No, that is not how I proceed, and that is not what I want them to do. But I think that the heart, the center of the paradigm is strong, clarity, especially in the social sciences. But at the edges, it becomes weak, it becomes fuzzy. I'm interested in that zone. I think there are periods of a kind of stability for paradigmatic knowledge. We had that in the post-World War II decades. There was a kind of a notion that when you said the state, the economy, the middle classes, the working classes, there was a kind of a stability to those meanings. I think that in the last 30 years, really beginning in the late 80s, they become unstable. And so the fuzzy edges is sort of the place where I want to check it all out, because that is possibly the area where you see the deep decay of a category, What is the middle class today? The middle class is, part of it has become richer than they ever thought, and part of it are getting poorer than they thought they were going to be. So it's an unstable meaning. What is the economy? What exactly is the national state today? When the state has enabled sort of very significant global processes. So that is a bit the thing. Now, the practices, I call sort of the actual research practices, I think of them as analytic tactics. So it's a tactical move. I want to discover something. I have to position myself this way. Rather than pulling down an established method, I might or I might not. So I just want to put my cards on the table, so to say, so that you can see. And I think that it's also interesting every now and then to give it a try, But, you have to be a bit crazy probably to do that. But now, so here are some of these analytic tactics. One is the need to actively destabilize stabilized meanings. In other words, you don't throw them simply out of the window, but you can actively destabilize them, to inquire, to interpolate them, to say, what does it really mean to say the middle classes today? It's different from what it was, in the 60s and in the 50s, etc. Secondly, in the shadow of powerful explanations, you can think of a very powerful explanation as a center of light, where you see everything. The light at night on a dark street. And the more that center of light is bright, the more difficult it is to see what lies in the shadow, in the penumbra, around that center of light. So my argument is we need to also move into that zone of a penumbra. We need explanations that eliminate elements. Otherwise, you have a description. An explanation means, this matters and this doesn't matter very much. So again, you can't just dismiss these explanations, but you can ask, what don't I see when I invoke a very powerful explanation? And I'll give you some examples as I show some of my sort of expulsions. There's a whole bit about territory, but I'm not going to get to that. And basically the idea is that territory is a very complex category. It's not space, it's not land, it's not terrain, it's not purely material. It has embedded logics of power, which in our Western modernity has been the liberal state, the working liberal state. It has embedded logics of claim making, which in our Western modernity, again, is citizenship. So territory is very complex. And I am sort of interrogating that category, arguing, what would I see if I made territory work analytically? Right now, it's not working analytically. It has a singular, powerful meaning, which is national sovereign territory, that's a valid meaning. But if a thing, even no matter how complex it is, if it has a single meaning, it's not working analytically. It's just sitting there. So I say, it's taking a very long analytic siesta, this category, and I want to wake it up. And sort of, you'll see that as I proceed with examples, that element is hanging in there. Now, finally, and this is critical to my talk today, and it's a very partial approach, but one that sort of gets at the heart of the matter, is this notion that we make justice, we make injustice, we make economies, we destroy economies. Now, that is clearly partial. There are all kinds of other things that happen, but the notion is, but I want to sort of emphasize, is that this stuff doesn't fall from the sky. We're not innocent. We are makers. So we make. We make this. This is the displaced people. Supposedly, this was a story that belonged to the post-World War II era, and it's just growing, right? We make it in many direct and indirect ways. We make this. It's an achievement. One of the biggest, this is the RLC, one of the biggest internal seas. Look at the water. We reduced billions of liters of water, gone. When I say we, clearly I'm using it rhetorically, right? This is what is left over. This little green strip, 20 years. It took only 20 years. You have to stand back and say, God, That's an achievement. It's, of course, a bad one. But we made that. And so this is a bit, I mean, again, it's an exaggerated because there are genealogies of meaning, because there are all kinds of other things, but you get the picture. We made this. We have eliminated the ice sheet. The permafrost is melting, which is going to produce a methane so strong that we have never experienced that. We made that. So you get, Now, one way of framing a lot of these very specific expulsions that I deal with is to ask the question, what is the steam engine of our epoch? The steam engine was a powerful event that transformed and altered matters directly or indirectly. So it was present sort of everywhere. It had some very good things and it had some very bad things. And so one way of thinking about this is, the steam engine as something that can make a new ordering, not change everything, but that a new logic of ordering is sort of part of it. And another way of thinking about it, what is in and what is out. Now, I hope that in the meantime, some of you have tried to answer that question in your own mind. And usually, if I get a chance to ask, the answer, can I hear just some answers? What is the steam engine of our epoch?
Internet.
Internet? Do we all agree?
Yes.
Right. Any other thing? Well, I think that is correct. But for the sake of provocation, I'm going to take you to another zone. The internet is truly everywhere. Directly and indirectly, it is altering matter. So it is in many ways a steam engine for our epoch. But I think there is another one which in a very short period of time and with an extraordinary amount of invisible violence has created new orderings. And that is finance. Not banking, finance. And finance is now, by the way, everything is a curve, and finance is beginning to exhaust its own power. But in the meantime, it has been a very significant factor. Now, very quickly, finance is not banking. The traditional bank sells something it has, money, for an interest rate. The finance sells something it does not have. And in that selling what it does not have lies its danger, because it needs to invade other sectors. That is why it is present directly or indirectly. And that invading requires extraordinarily complex instruments. It's the math not of microeconomics, it's the math of physics. In other words, those who track what cannot be known. It's algorithmic, it's open. What you put in matters in terms of what comes out. It's not a closed system as with microeconomics. So for instance, these buildings, if you think of Goldman Sachs, sort of typical corporate office, there's always a space that is typically called the back room. The back room is the space of the secretaries. Not now, not in the last 20 years. The back room at Goldman Sachs had 100 physicists sitting there. Now, I love physicists, but it's also true that once they turn 30, they often don't know what to do with themselves. I don't know if there is a physicist here. And so I think that physics and philosophy, by the way, are the forms of knowledge for this epoch. Not for the epoch of 20 years ago, but for this epoch. Very interesting, sort of complex openness, possibilities, lack of certainties. Very interesting. Anyhow, so these physicists, of course, were addressing a technical problem. And one technical problem where I want to use to illustrate is that how do you manage, when you are invading other sectors, at some point you're running out of high quality sectors, fancy office buildings, that you financialize. But eventually you run out and you wind up with very modest assets. Used car loans, student loans, all of that has been partly financialized. which means that you're using it to build a much bigger value. The one that I want to show you very quickly is the subprime mortgage. You have all, who has, I was going to ask who has not heard of the subprime mortgage, but I don't want to. But have most people sort of, do you know what the subprime mortgage is? Well, it doesn't matter really, I'll tell you. So first, this is finance as capability, right? Look at this growth curve. So 201, it's under $1 trillion. That's a lot of zeros, you know that part. 201, 6 years later, it's 62 trillion. Think of anything that has that growth rate. Very few things. Finance is very good at this. Now, second point to make, these 62 trillion in 2007 were more than the total GDP of all the countries in the world, which is about 54 trillion. That is finance, you know, it's something that you cannot break down to money, let's say. The value of finance as measured by outstanding derivatives was 630 trillion at that point. Today it's over a quadrillion. Keeps growing very quickly, more zeros. Quadrillion is 3 more zeros, right, than a trillion. 600 trillion is a lot of money, but it's not real money. So I ask myself when I'm doing this research, I say, okay, how much currency is there in the world? Currency being the money issued by central banks of all the countries in the world. At that point, it was about 200 trillion. So you know that finance is all. Now, it's very easy for finance to go beyond that, you know, because it is a speculative chain. It's not currency. It's not cash. But that level, so that is what I mean. We have to think about finance as a capability, and in that sense as a steam engine, rather than just something about money. We use money, we monetize because it's the only way we can count. But, you know, it's not. Now, here, the black pools, I'll pass this by. Now, here's the example that I want to use. And as you see from the title, this is sort of the provocation, if you want. That is when modest neighborhoods, little houses, become part of global finance. This is a contradiction. In other words, a traditional banker would go for high-value assets. They wouldn't want to be bothered. But finance, it's just so different. It has to invade other sectors, and it will go for it. As I said, used car loans, that's really a low-value asset. Now, as you see very quickly here, the challenge and the physicists made the difference. The challenge was to use a little modest house to create an instrument that you could describe as an asset, in other words, something real, so to speak, backed financial instrument. The language is security, but that doesn't matter. The challenge was to delink that instrument from that modest value, because the high-level investors at that point are saying, finance, give me some real stuff, rather than a derivative based on an interest rate based on another derivative. So the challenge was, where do we find material goods? And that is where this instrument comes from. Now, the physicists developed the instrument that they needed. 16, I've seen it, 16 complex steps. So they are there. It's a technical problem. You know, they're totally engaged with how do we delink the asset, even though it's going to be there. To make a story very short, all they wanted was sign the contract. And the delinking was built from the actual house. So that put all kinds of modest people at risk. In the United States, if you're going to use houses as an asset, you wind up with people who actually thought they could not afford to buy a house, because 70% of people own their house in this country. So you're dealing really with very, very modest, very, very fragile you know, households, if you want, in terms of money. Now, each of the agents that was in this game had to get 500 contracts signed in a week to make it work. So they went and they said, you don't have to pay anything for 5 years, just sign. 15 million, this is central bank, our Fed data, 15 million contracts were signed in a period of about 7 years. You understand what this is? Do people get the sense? It's very bad. Anyhow, so the result is every year there are the figures. It really takes off in 2006, 1.2, and before that, you know, those are households. Every year, this is not cumulative, huh? And the last ones, you know, here we go. So when Bernanke, the head of the Fed, ended his mandate, you know, and he said, among other things, he said a bunch of things, but one of the things he said, and we are going to have 14 million households that are now under foreclosure procedures losing their homes. He said it, not me. That's a lot. 14 million households is about 30 million people. I'm Dutch. My country has 16 million. Is the one who laughed a Dutch person? Because my country has 16 million people. Getting 30 million, and that's a low estimate, people out of their homes, it's as if a voice would have said in the Netherlands, from above, said, okay, all of you on the territory of the Netherlands, out. Where you go, I don't know, but out. And now we're going to repeat the exercise. That is the materiality of 30 million people. And most of those people are invisible. This comes back to this notion, you know, that it can be very material, but it's somehow invisible. Now, this is sort of a chart that shows you this is the acute point, but as you can see, you know, 1,700,000, no, not everybody, not every single household, but the vast majority, according to the central bank, the Fed. So this is a brutal history. And for what? To accumulate extraordinary wealth at the top of the system. Finance is so powerful that it cannot be governed, nor does it govern itself. So it produced the crises, right? They overdid. This was one factor, mind you, the values of this, nothing to do with the actual value that was lost. That is another story. Now, the Europeans think that that is not happening in their well-run countries. You know, is anybody here European? You know what I mean? Well, there we are. Look at this. Germany. I have quite a few of these numbers in the book. So Germany, who supposedly gets it all right. Germany is a very reasonable country, and Berlin is full of wonderful Germans, okay? So I am not trying to be negative here. I'm just talking about governments and such. So 91, this is just a few years. These are annual, every year. Hungary, by the way, 1 million households in a very small country. It's disastrous. It's invisible. Nice countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, you know, good social blah blahs, also there. These are these invisible little histories in the making. And wait till this instrument hits India and China. It's an incredibly powerfully designed instrument by these brilliant physicists. How do you delink from the actual value of the asset so that what happens to the asset doesn't really matter at all? All you need is a contract. That's an achievement, and it still works as an asset-backed security, for those of you who follow that language. Now, the outcome, in a way, the image that I want to leave you with, I'm going to give you several of these questions of urban land. The outcome is a lot of empty land. Nobody goes there. In New York, we have neighborhoods with all kinds of houses. New York is not the worst case. You know, the really bad cases are we have several critical states where this has happened at a very, very extreme level. But you wind up with sort of abandoned space, houses, weeds, etc., etc. Now, I want to give you another mutation of urban land, which is that big investors, those who have all the piles of cash, they don't know what to do with it. So there seems to have been a big decision to buy pieces of land, of urban land, not just land grabs in the global south, that's also happening. So here are some figures. I'm working with a data set that has the 100 cities that are the top destinations for corporate investment. Now, how do you buy urban land? You don't buy urban land, you understand, because urban land has buildings on it, etc. You buy it in the form of buildings. But when the amount of capital is as high as it is happening, and this takes off after 2008, in other words, after the crisis starts, you have to stand back and ask yourself, what is happening? a very common, now I should explain that what we're talking about is corporate investment. The smallest investments that are counted in this data set are $5 million. So we're not talking little cute homes. We're talking fairly big. The issue is corporate. Whether it's foreign or national is really, I think, secondary. But what happens when a big corporate acquisition is made of land, say a block or 2 blocks of city land? It can be much bigger. A big Chinese corporation just bought Atlantic Yards, hello there, Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn, which is a huge patch of land, much bigger than 2 blocks. It's more like 20 or 30 blocks. So, and all nationalities, by the way, many different countries are doing this. But the issue is that when a corporate buys that kind of land, what happens is that the project can be a mega project that winds up occupying that space. Little streets disappear, little squares, the urban tissue is destroyed. It becomes private, probably with guards. It becomes a huge, whatever it might be, office or office sort of complex or a shopping mall, whatever it might be, but it becomes private. So it actually, even if it's very dense, it adds to the density of the city. It's actually de-urbanizing because it becomes a private space. For me, as a footnote, I really care about the city, sort of the substantive meaning of city. The city is a place where the powerless get to make an economy, a culture, a history, and there are not many places where they can do that. Think of immigrant communities, very modest, but the city sort of is a bit messy, a bit anarchic, a bit sort of complex but incomplete, interventions can happen. The powerless are not going to make a history in an office park. Don't you have an office park here in Orange County? It's a guarded, that's not. Whereas in your little neighborhood, maybe a bit of a rundown neighborhood, you fix it up, you make a little neighborhood economy, whatever. Of course, I think that you live here in such a perfect place that probably what I'm talking when I say messy neighborhood probably does not resonate. But some of you must know what I'm talking about. So here are some of the figures then. And again, and by the way, I should also say that people sometimes think, gentrification, because a corporate comes in, buys up. And I think gentrification is not enough. And let me give you an example. This is just a little example which captures why the language of gentrification is not enough to explain what is happening here. So right now, the biggest owner of land, or let me be more precise, the Qatari royals, Qatar, Doha, they own more of London than the Queen of England. That is not gentrification, you understand? We're talking about 2 extremely wealthy. That is something else. And again, I mentioned, a foreign country. I really don't think that the foreignness is the issue. I think it's the fact that it is corporate investment. Now, this is just for 1 year, okay? Sort of 2013 to 2014. This is 55 billion. Now, every year this has been happening. It just keeps growing. In the United States, if I had the full, we have several cities in the United States. And but as you can see, it's quite a mix of cities. And here, if you take this slide, so here you get a sense that there are a few cities at the top that get a lot. And then you have this dribble and goes on, 100 cities. It just would go all around the room here. I immediately had imagined it, and there's probably a technology that would allow you to wrap it around visually. Anyhow, and here, if you look at foreign, you see it changes a bit. So London especially, most of it is foreign, not in New York. New York is mostly national. Most of the investment in American cities is actually mostly national, not exclusively. So in New York, for instance, Kazakhstan is buying, the Russians are buying, I already mentioned the Chinese companies are buying, all kinds of European nationalities are buying. So, and again, I really think that, and you can disagree with me, that the fact that it is national or foreign is not the issue here. I think the issue is something else. Now, one way of thinking back to the steam engine and sort of a bit along these lines is that the bridge into even the most modest household. And I want you, I am silent for a minute to see if some of you imagine, how does a corporate sector access households? Well, shopping is the self-evident thing, right? But the other big one, oh, I missed my slide. The other big one, there's a slide that was meant to be there with one little word in a blank slide. Can you visualize it? That said, debt. Anyhow, so I want to give you just some examples. You don't get terrified of all the numbers. I just want to illustrate a few. So first we start with the title. By the way, these are a lot of the data that I use either comes from central banks. Central banks are research institutions. I really recommend all my students know how to access the website, say, of the Fed. We have several federal banks, but certainly the main one. So, and the other thing is the IMF staff papers. The IMF staff papers are amazing, do amazing research, but it doesn't get published. So anyhow, a lot of my data comes from IMF staff papers, I repeat, and from the central banks of different countries, etc. Now look at the title. Ratio of household credit to personal disposable income. Credit sounds really pretty. Money to spend. Credit is debt. Credit just makes it unreal. No, it doesn't sound as bad as debt. So anyhow, so now look, this is a critical period. The same thing that I was showing about the subprime mortgage, etc. Right? So there is what you have is powerful financial institutions moving into modest worlds. Modest mortgages, modest, in this case, sort of average households, etc. Now look, Hungary. Let's take Hungary. It was 11%. This is incredibly modest because they didn't really have a banking system, right? They're coming out from a period. The United States at that point was already over 100%. You understand? You're spending more than you have, right? That's the idea. And 5 years later, Hungary, almost 40%. That's a sharp curve. The United States also grew, but actually in relative terms much less. It was at 132%. On the other hand, the Germans, or Germany, 70, 70, 70, 70, like nothing had happened, where all kinds of other things were happening. It's just impressive. Whereas Spain reflects the crisis. Spain, it was 65%, which is very reasonable, and then it was over 100. That was part of the crisis. Now, I then ask myself, who owns that household debt? Now I go digging again in the IMF papers, and in the case of Hungary, up to 40% is foreign owned. And we know who owns that debt. It is big German banks, Swiss banks, and Austrian banks especially. There are other nationalities. That is not good. And I'm assuming that you can understand why that is not good. It means that, if a little bank, a little credit union, a rotating credit, whatever, owns your debt, chances are that the interest, the capacity that a locality has to pay interest is money that then will circulate in the community, so to say. That's the ideal, right? And hence it has a growth effect on that community. If a big bank owns it, they take it out. Who knows where they put it? In Indonesia, who knows where they invest it? In the United States, that has now declined a bit. There was a moment when 70% of all consumer debt was owned by the 5 big banks. That is really bad. That is bad for those communities, for those households, etc. Because, you want these things to have added growth effects, to circulate, etc. So now I'm going to move on. Now, one way then of beginning to think about it is there a new systemic, and that also then goes back at what I was saying at the beginning, that just saying inequality is not enough. There is something else. So often when I speak about inequality per se, I say, okay, let's bring social justice. Social justice does not require complete equality, but it requires the avoiding of certain extreme forms of inequality, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to take it a bit further. So here, this graph, these are lines that for me tell a tale. So I want you to see that all of these countries, including Germany, including the Netherlands, including strong countries, they all experienced in that period, 2008, 2009, etc., a dip. All of them. When the German Minister of Finance, Schäuble, says, no, the Greeks, and they don't know how to handle them, the Baba, and I don't need to repeat, right? No, Germany also. This is systemic. It's just that Greece is an extreme case. Spain is quite extreme too. The language that has been issued, that has been sort of produced, if you want, in the last, 5-6 years in Europe by the European Central Bank, by the IMF, and by the German, which are very significant, as you well know in the case of Europe, the European Union, is that somehow Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Italy have created their own problems, that they do it wrong. If you look at this graph, you see that all these countries had a dip. Germany does much better on the recovery. Why? Because it has one of the most powerful intermediate manufacturing sectors. Machines that make machines. Everybody needs them. And that manufacturing is a very distributed sector, etc. That is what helped them. But the main point that I'm trying to make, yes, Greece is extreme partly because they have oligarchs who, basically are stealing the money from the country and not reinvesting at all. But anyhow, I think I don't need to repeat it again. Now, here I want to show you some curves. Again, disregard all of this. Okay, we're talking corporate profits. This comes from the Fed, the local Feds, the regional Feds, the central banks, in other words. Look at this. So here comes the crisis. They're doing very well. Then comes the crisis, which lasts about 2 hours. And then the curve is even higher. They do better after the crisis. By the way, it's 2 years, okay? The dip, but that's nothing. Everybody else is suffering the losses, etc. Profit rates or the corporate profits, right, they go up. Look at this. This is corporate assets. This is like it. I can't see this thing here. This lasts about half an hour, so to speak, right? Just a little dip, barely can see it. And now that tells you something. And there's something, it tells you all kinds of things, but there's something that I want to emphasize is here is this profound divergent logic that is organizing our economies. You have those 15 million households or 14 million households out of their homes, impoverished, et cetera, et cetera. You have all kinds of laid off people. You have the jobs, when the crisis hits, 65% of the jobs in the United States that were lost were middle-class jobs. In the recovery, only 25% of jobs are middle-class jobs. The other jobs are either very high-level jobs or they're very low-level jobs. So there are losses. There are losses in many, many places. And in the meantime, they have a curve that goes even better. So this is a divergent economy. This kind of divergence also camouflages some of the deep trends that are happening. It's not easy. Like right now, all that is mentioned when we mention jobs have been added is that jobs have been added. What we're not saying is that many of them are very low-wage jobs and they're not replacing the jobs that were lost. 65% middle-class jobs lost, that has a big impact, right? That is a serious thing. Now, in the meantime, our governments are all getting poorer. Here are a few exceptions, the extreme cases, etc., like the Japanese. But look at the United States debt. This is the debt. 25% in 1980. It seems unreal, and today is 61%. The Germany, it was 13%, and now it's 33. I can't quite see, but you see what I mean, right? So Germany 13. 44. Now, Germany is still doing very well, but the point is that our governments are getting poorer. So we in the United States, you all know this, we have 6,000 bridges at least, some people say it's 15,000, that we know are going to fall. but there is no money to fix them. What has happened? Why is our corporate sectors gaining, and governments are losing, and of course the middle classes are losing, etc. So these are extraordinary, sort of alarming trends, if you want. And the issue, just saying, it's more inequality, is not allowing us to really get at the heart of the matter. Now, I want to ask you, I tell my students, this is a graph they should all just know, like you know that 1 and 1 is 2. I want to know, have any of you seen this graph? This is by now a very well-known graph. Nobody has seen it? Well, look, this is one of, again, I love these simple lines, you know, that have narrative capacity. This is about 100 years, not quite. Huh? This is 1917, it's the United States. This actually goes on this curve till the 2009, you know, the income is counted in the census the year before. Yeah, so we call it the 2010 census, but it's really till 2009. It includes 2009. Now, income share of top 10% earners. This is not inherited wealth. This is jobs, what the jobs pay. You know. So they are doing very, very well, 47%, you know, in this period. Then comes the big crash. And then we see this line here, 1942. You have all kinds of war, economy, etc. 1987 goes back up. This allows you to infer, it doesn't demonstrate, but you can infer that here we see the growth of a middle class. These people, instead of 47 at the high point now, account for 33%. That's still a very robust share, right? I mean, 33% is not bad, but it's less. So you have, now, when you read the literature of this period, of the experts, they say, now that we found the algorithm to have a stronger middle class and a prosperous working class, we are not going to give it up. And before we knew it, 1987, and it was gone. And so we have, again, this incredible, you follow what I'm saying, right? So this tells you policy and the structure of the economy, because what you have here is, of course, mass construction of suburbs, mass manufacturing. The economy needs people as workers and as consumers. The workers get to organize, they get to raise their own wages. The reasonable wage is good because it's consumption-based. It's a fairly closed economy, not completely. So there was a kind of very good algorithm at work. There was racism, discrimination against blacks, against women, against whatever. But there was also a core that expanded the economy. What we have today is a kind of shrinking economic space. More and more people are left out. We still haven't recovered all the jobs that we lost, for instance, just to mention this one data. Now here you have another version of the same thing. Huh? This is after-tax income. So you see the top, you know, the top 1%, almost 300%, right, from 79 to 2009. Then you have this intermediate, 95% growth. But then you have, and this becomes very visible in the incredible gentrification of high-valued areas of cities, in the whole new sort of that 20% at the top that is just buying very expensive designer goods, you know, very visible, especially in cities. And then you have 40% where there was almost nothing happening. And that's pretty invisible stuff, actually. Now, many of these people may have owned their homes, and if you walk in their neighborhoods, the facades look the same. It's all very neat. What is invisible is what's happening behind those facades. And we know from all kinds of, you know, partial data that what's happening behind those facades is over doubling up, tripling up, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this notion of these material conditions that somehow can be invisible. Now, I think I have to really move on. This is another way of showing it. You know, it's like This is ratio of 1% wealth to median wealth. So you have this sort of slight growth. And then 2007, this is the moment of the crises. Look how it goes up. Interesting, no? It also, well, anyhow, there are many stories there. Same thing here. This is bottom fifth. You can see that up till the middle fifth, that is more than half, lost. And then this is a breakdown, you know, and you can see that the higher up you go, the more. But you follow what this, you don't understood that graph, right? Now, I know that I have to finish, right? I'm seeing the clock. I've been talking for an hour. My God, 2 minutes is too much. No, too little, the 2 minutes, too much, the hour, right? So in the shadows of urbanization, here I want to come back to this notion when we have a very powerful category like urbanization, what don't we see? And so I go digging, at the edges. And so one thing that we don't see is the extent to which that growth in urban population is a kind of people who are being expelled from where they are. One factor in this expelling is land grabs that are happening everywhere. Huh? And when you consider the also corporate investments in the United States, small farmers lose and there's a lot of that. And yeah, but this is focused especially, these are global data, Land Matrix, the best network if you're interested in these data. So as you can see, just here is a mini picture, 220 million hectares in those 4 or 5 years. It only includes properties over 200 hectares. That's quite a bit of land. Financial firms bought land and hedge funds bought land. Not because they were going to become farmers, but because that was a good investment. And here you have some of the figures. Africa is still the main. The yellow one is what counts here. Africa is still the main, but you can see also in Europe, I have quite a few examples. And basically in the world, it's growing. Critical element, most of the land is being bought to grow for biofuels, which means the toxicity in the land is extreme because it's not food. So you want to make it grow, make it grow. That also means that in areas around these plantations, because we're talking plantations here, the toxicity is so terrible that even those who are still small farmers, they can't live. So what happens when you set up a plantation? You evict floras, faunas, rural cultures of production and all kinds of things. Where do those people go? They go to cities. They feed the slums. Some slums are good, some slums are not so good. And that is, and when you hear politicians say, most people live in cities, as if somehow, they fell from the sky, there are a lot of different histories behind that growth in an urban population. Now, I am going to leave all of that because it's too much. I just want to finish with one item. And let's just focus on this question. You might really ask, who are we, the citizens, when so many negatives are happening to so many people, and when the middle classes are getting overall poorer, and the sons and daughters are not doing better than the parents, as was the history of an earlier era. And I want to ask you, who has seen this map? This is a map that is in the public domain. Has anybody seen this map? You saw it? So the red dots, the darling, pretty red dots, those are 10,000 buildings that are in the business of full-time data gathering. It's not surveillance, they're just data gathering. And you know what we're talking about. They're mostly private, 1 million people in private firms, mostly, have top-level clearance. Mr. Snowden was in there, but he was in Hawaii, so it's not on this map. Here they keep adding. In the Washington area, the survey and the data gathering apparatus occupies the equivalent of 5 pentagons in terms of space. I have very detailed data. This is all in the public domain, by the way. Eh? How it got to the public domain is another question, but it is in the public domain. Now, the logic of this system, for our security, we first have to be suspect. They're gathering data all the time. Our universities, because we have a mini state of security, right? We know that. So does Germany, so does France. It means that, for instance, all our universities, the administrators can read our emails. They are authorized. Because we are all suspect. That is the logic of the system. It's a very peculiar logic. You can ask yourself, who wins? The tech companies win, clearly. Do we, the citizens, win? So anyhow, this is one other part of this. Oh, thank you very much.